Good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Friday Night Fireside Chats. I'm your host, Roy. If you are new to the podcast, Friday Night Fireside Chats is a time to slow down, relax from a busy work week, and enter into a time of reflection. And the topics of this podcast are usually focused around self-inquiry and self-understanding. And for tonight's topic, I will be talking about initiation and rites of passage. Now, this topic is closely related to the work that I do. So if you've visited my website, which is www.sacredwildman.com, you will get an idea of what I do. But in short, my work as a therapist is focused around helping men reclaim their masculinity. And this specialty and focus that I have is very much closely related to my own personal journey of reclaiming my own masculinity. And that has been a wild journey, and certainly one that I would not trade. Just thinking about where I am now, how I experience myself now, to even just 5 years ago, it's pretty close to looking at two very different people almost. And certainly to some people that I was in community with at the time, people were certainly aware of those changes. And I think for some people it was very, I don't know if shocking is what they would say, but it was definitely noticeable. And I very much would say that that change has much to do with my own journey of initiation and a rites of passage in all the different ways that it took place. Now, this topic I'll mostly be speaking about it in regards to men, since that's the focus of my work. However, I think much of what I say also can apply to women, and in terms of women's rites of passage and initiation, the passage from a young girl to a grown woman. And so, speaking about men, I will be sharing about some of my own journey, but this initiation from boyhood into manhood, and from boy psychology into man psychology. And those two terms of boy psychology and man psychology come from the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. It's written by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. And I would highly recommend that book to any men who are listening, young men who are interested in this topic of initiation. If there's something there that just calls out to you, I highly recommend checking that book out. So, initiation and rites of passage. How I see those terms, really it just speaks to the journey of, I guess, maturation and becoming. In other ways, it's an unfolding. So it's probably unfolding and becoming. And there's a transition process from what you could call the old guard into the new guard. Other ways in which it can be spoken about is the hero's journey, and that that would be in Joseph Campbell's realm of expertise. I think he was the one who coined that term. But basically, the hero's journey speaks about this this process where a person experiences some sort of, issue in their life that causes them to reevaluate some things, and that brings them into an entry of a whole different territory, a whole new terrain in their life that is a departure from what's familiar. And in that journey, there's a meeting of allies, a helper or a guide. There's a process of death where you go into this underworld and you experience the trials. And then there's the return where you go back to perhaps a community of people you came from, and you bring back the knowledge and experience that you gain from that. And I would say for both, so the hero's journey and initiation, there's a process of dying. And it seems to me that pretty much all cultures across the world have some, I don't know, what's the word? Some, I guess, spirituality or some conceptual framework attached to death, and that it's not seen as a scary or a bad thing, but it's actually seen in a very wholesome light, where death is simply a transition to what is next, and a necessary part of life. That life and death are two sides of the same coin. Whereas my impression here in the West is that we do our very best to avoid it. It's not something we're kind of encouraged to think about until we're in old age and decrepit and on the way to death's doors do we begin even talking about it. And even now, I think, in the modern 21st century, it's even more so avoided. Just thinking about the response of people to the pandemic. Yes, it's understandable that the fear people have, but it really strikes me that there is such a huge reaction of fear, and certainly I ascribe a lot of that to the media. The media's portrayal of all of this played a big part in that. But this huge and intense reaction of fear, to me, what I was seeing was that people began to behave in a way where this seemed like the worst thing possible, and that they were or are willing to sacrifice some things in order to extend their life, perhaps by another minute, by another hour, another day, another week, another month, or another year. And yet that comes with a price of misery, a price of living in fear and anxiety, a price of living a small, fearful life. And what struck me was even hearing from some of the elderly and how they were treated in all of this. Some had shared that they would rather die and be with their families than to be isolated off, not able to see any of their family, or just having to see their family through a glass partition. That they would rather die and be with family than to live a so-called safe life and not get sick. And so perhaps the elderly, those who voiced that experience, have more wisdom about all of this than many of those who are younger and still have more life to live. That those who are closest to death's doors have greater insight into what it means to live than those who are younger. And even speaking that out loud right now, it strikes me as really profound. And to think about how that wisdom has also become something that we've here in the West really become divorced from, in terms of how we respect the elderly, what kind of regard we hold them in. I think nowadays there's more of a sense of obligation and inconvenience, and let's just throw them in some nursing homes and have somebody else take care of them, and we're just kind of waiting until they bite the dust. It's just my own personal sense of it. Certainly it's not a one-size-fits-all, and I'm not saying it applies to everyone, but as a whole, in a collective in the West, that's the impression that I get. So the aspect of death is something that is deeply feared in the West, it seems. And due to that fear, I think that is what keeps so many of the people here in the West stuck in a very adolescent form or stage of psychology. And so, speaking just about men, since again that's more the focus of my work, in regards to death and what this pandemic has shown, to me anyways, most people are stuck in that boy psychology rather than men psychology. And I don't know, I don't have a answer of how this came to be in the West, how Western culture seems to be more absent in terms of a spiritual understanding and respect or value for death that other cultures have. But I think people are yearning for this rite of passage, this initiation. They're likely just not consciously aware of it. One example of how I see this taking place is the rise in interest among people in plant medicines, psychedelics, or the interest in people who go to the East. There's one thing that I notice is that in a lot of films, TV shows, or some sort of media outlet, there's always this thing where some young person or whatever their age might be says, I'm gonna go to China to find myself, or I'm gonna go to Thailand, India, Africa, somewhere that's not the West, in order to discover and find myself. And it's interesting because you don't ever hear anybody, at least I haven't, say, "Oh, I'm gonna go to the West to find myself." Usually going to the West is more associated with, I have a dream of building a certain life, and this is where I want to go because I've heard this is a land of opportunity, so that's why I want to come here to try to build that dream. So there's positives to both, but this increase in interest in plant medicine, psychedelics, and going to the East, going to places such as Thailand or India to live a monastic life, studying at a temple, rigorous meditation, or some sort of more esoteric spiritual practices. In all of that, it strikes me as a seeking of, this is rather ambiguous, but I think that's the best way to start first, is to go to ambiguous and get more specific, but a seeking of something that they feel they clearly can't find in the West, in the life that they have been used to. And that bears a pretty close resemblance to, the hero's journey. There's this call, there's this tug to something new, something different. And so in that journey to either a foreign land or a foreign state of consciousness via plant medicine or psychedelic, there's a rites of passage that is being embarked upon. And along the way, there's certainly going to be a encounter with a sort of symbolic death. And speaking mainly of plant medicines, psychedelics, or let's say rigorous meditation, one of the most common things that people hear or share is the experience of a ego death. And this is an experience where the ego, or a person's sense of self, is completely obliterated, essentially. There's not a really light way to put it. It's a pretty disruptive experience to have an ego death. And it's a huge reset button. It is, if you've seen the movie The Matrix, it is the moment where Neo takes the red pill. And it's not a pleasant experience. If you've watched the movie, you'll see that it's not a pleasant experience when he takes this red pill. And oftentimes people can, especially when they think about enlightenment, there's this, however it got started, but this rosy image of, yes, I have seen and I have now ascended, and I understand that often isn't the case. It often is a lot more disruptive and can send a person into a state of psychosis. And that ego death is, to me, a death, simply put. Yeah, it's not a physical death. And the whole idea with initiation and rites of passage is that the idea is not about a physical death. A physical death is, at least in this incarnation of existence, more so a final stage, if you will, a final stage for this incarnation before a transition to the next. But everything kind of leading up to that, whenever that happens for each respective person, everything leading up to that is perhaps one could call preparation. And so it's mainly these symbolic deaths, whether that's emotional, mental, spiritual, form of death that leads to a great cracking open of something for a person. And therein is an opportunity for something new to be born. The classic example I think of is a caterpillar spinning a cocoon and then dissolving into a primordial soup within that cocoon, and that dissolving is that ego death. I've known my life as a caterpillar. Now, what the hell is this thing that I'm doing right now? I don't feel so good. What is this? I'm soup. And then suddenly, perhaps there's a period of nothingness, and then darkness and nothingness, and then from there emerges this new birth of this butterfly and a new consciousness of, now I have wings and I can fly. That is the journey, and likely many, many journeys of that sort of ego death or symbolic death for us all to experience before that final physical death and transition. But when I hear people say that they're interested in doing plant medicine or psychedelics or rigorous meditation or living a monastic life, to me, I'm hearing that yearning for a rites of passage, an initiation, and a leaving everything they have known for this something that seems to tug at them. And to me, it makes sense why that feeling is there. Because it's a deep part of, I think, our history and the memory that is embedded within our very DNA and in our very bones. So an example of this, talking about the transition from boy psychology to man psychology, I believe there's a tribe in Papua New Guinea, and this is where they talked about their initiation ritual for their boys when it's time for them to become men. And I can't recall what age they are, but it seems like when they're just adolescents, maybe 15 or 16, that's when it happens. So That's my recollection, but don't quote me on it. But essentially what they do in this initiation ritual is that night, the elders and the men, the warriors of the tribe, they have these masks that they put on. And in the darkness of night, what they do is they go into the village. They go into the village and they essentially kidnap the boys from their mothers. And the mothers are in on it. They are in on this whole thing. And so they play their part, and it's almost this great drama that they are performing that is part in this ritual. And so the mothers cry and they plead and they beg, don't take our boys from us. No, don't take our boys. And crying and lamenting. But the adult men of the village come and they take the boys away. And they take them to some place, that is secret. Only the men and the boys can be here. This is where my recollection of it gets fuzzy. But two pieces I'm thinking about is one is like there's a throwing of them into the forest. It's like, all right, good luck, fend for yourself tonight, and hopefully we'll see you in the morning. And if not, well, guess you're dead. And it sounds horrifying. I think to many people just listening from life as they've known it in the West. Probably many would consider that some aspect of child abuse and a crime. But that's what they do. And there's another one where this is where I get lost, like between if it's just that forest and fend for yourself that night, or it's two combined. But anyways, the other thing that I recall reading and hearing about is when the men kidnap the boys, the men wear these masks, and these masks carry a very sort of beastly, demonic sort of expression to incite this sense of primal terror. And the boys have to wrestle the men of the village. And so there's like a circle of men, and the boy in the middle of that circle has to wrestle each man. And they push him. They definitely push him, but there's also some level of give in it, because if they really wanted to overpower the boy, like, no problem. But there's some level of give, and they push that boy to the edge of his limits, or the limits that he has conceived for himself, because there's something beyond that. That's where this primal energy and beast within a person can actually arise when there's that level of pressure applied. And so when the final man is being wrestled and finally is defeated, or kind of allowed to be defeated by the boy, he then takes his mask off and then puts it on the boy's face. And the whole idea is that is the transition. That is the initiation, where the young boy psychology has died, and he has now moved into the realm of men. He is now that beast. He is now that warrior. He has conquered that demon. And when I first read and heard that, as much as I feel some degree of fear of like, gosh, that would be so disorienting to experience as a adolescent boy. There's another part of me that is just deeply invigorated and aroused by the notion of actually having that experience. And the reason I say that is because in my waking reality, and even in dreams, I have moments where I have faced and encountered and felt this primal part of me. That's the whole reason I named my website Sacred Wildman, my business Sacred Wildman, because there's something very sacred about this wild man archetype in each man, and that's my own conviction. And it's something deep within our DNA, and it's something we've also become very divorced from and neutered in a way in modern society. Some cultures still preserve it and honor it, but speaking just of the West, I think it's lost completely. And what is in place are more superficial rituals of initiation that don't provide any of that significance at all. For example, man turns 21. It's like, hey, you can drink. Pop's gonna get you a beer. And or maybe it's like, hey, you go out with your buddies and then you just bar hop until you're shit-faced, and your reward is, hey, you got to drink, you're 21, and tomorrow you wake up hungover, and there you go, you're a man now. Like, what kind of significance does that actually offer a man? Personally, my opinion, not very much. It's a very shallow cultural sort of initiation tradition, in my opinion. But again, cultures are different. So for people who enjoy that, more power to you. But to me, it does not tap into that that primal part of men and that ancient DNA of what it means to transition from a boy to a man, and the symbolic death that is part of that transition. And looking at the modern man, to me, it's not hard to see the effects of that. Many of the clients that I've worked with, there's this sense that they can't make things happen. There's a sense of incompetence or impotence. A very conditioned and civilized person. And not to say being civilized is wrong or bad, but it's very much this sense that a man has been neutered, that he doesn't have his strong masculine edge anymore, but is just this polite, docile, people-pleasing person. Or on the flip side, he's very much a control freak and hot-tempered. Both sides of that spectrum, just two sides of the same coin, both represent to me a boy psychology and an immature man. Like, when I think of a mature man who has transitioned from boy psychology to man psychology, who's undergone this rites of passage and this death, symbolic death, it's a man who has strong convictions, is very solid, and is neither hot-tempered nor a pushover. And I'm sure many people have some image of who that man would be for them. So for me, I think of some examples: Denzel Washington, Bruce Lee, Malcolm X, just to name a few who stand out to me as these men who very much embody that man psychology, very self-assured, and also not wrapped up in a lot of ego either, because again, that ego is what also dies in that transition. So yeah, I think many men out there are hungry for that. And one of the ways in which I first really began to come into touch with this, because for most of my life it was completely absent. I was very much that docile, polite, people-pleasing person. And it's no wonder to me now, looking back, why I also had a huge amount of self-hate and resentment, because while part of me enjoyed being this nice guy who could be approved of by other people, albeit superficially, another part of me was deeply enraged with myself of why are you doing this? Why are you such a pushover? Why is it so necessary for you to please other people when you know that's not what you want to do? Like you actually want to say something straight. You want to say it direct. You don't want to beat around the bush about it. But I was always so terrified of doing that. I speak more about this actually in a separate video if you're interested in more about, self-hate, resentment, its origins, where it comes from, and ways to deal with it. It's on my YouTube channel, which you can find through the link through my website, www.sacredwildman.com. But as I became aware of this primal, violent part of me, like that's the beginning stages of reawakening this wild man archetype. It's knocking on the door, and dreams were often the first place where I encountered this part of me. There's always this sense of being chased by something, and as I began to reconnect with this primal part of me, while also being very afraid of it at the same time, that deeper part of me, this ancient DNA collective memory, was very much pulling me towards paths to begin to uncover this energy. And so I worked with a woman, I worked with group settings where they utilized, I guess you could call it sort of like shamanic journey work type. I guess just it would be called shamanic journey work. And it's, I guess I won't go into too much detail of explaining what it is. It's, I'm sure, something you are able to look up if you're more interested in learning what it is. But it was very powerful, and it put me in touch with parts of myself that I had long been repressing. And one of them was this wild man. And in some of the sessions, with the woman that I worked with, and also in the group setting, there were times where I was screaming really loud, and it wasn't, screaming in agony, but it was this very guttural scream and this roar, this very wild energy. Essentially, I was saying it was sick and tired of sitting in the back seat, sick and tired of being forgotten, sick and tired of being told it was bad, And you know, that he wanted center stage now. He wasn't going to be ignored any longer. And that was a huge shift for me, because again, before, I was just this nice, people-pleasing, docile, quiet guy. And as what's his name? I think Robert Glover, who wrote the book No More Mr. Nice Guy. He has a part where he says that usually the nicer the guy, the darker the darker he is, the more he's actually hiding. And just looking at myself, I very much see the validity in that statement. And so to finally unleash this wild part of me in a appropriate container, because it's not like I'm having free reign to do whatever the hell that I want and harm other people, but I was in this appropriate container where I was allowed to express myself through roaring, yelling, which also later led to a lot of crying, and this just very deep, guttural infant cry. And so it was very profound to have this well of anger and this well of sadness come up. And to me, I experienced that as a death, a symbolic death in my journey. And that's something that has happened many times, and I'm sure there will be other iterations of it. Maybe less extreme, who knows? But it was a death, because what had died was this part of me that was convinced I could only know myself in this way. I can only know myself and be the nice, docile, people-pleasing guy, because I had convinced myself this is the way to live. This is the only way I can live. Any other way for me to live, I'm going to be rejected, and that's painful. I don't like being rejected, and so I gotta take the path of least resistance, that I held on to for so long, holding on for dear life. Just this buoy in a wild ocean, a turbulent ocean. I was just clinging for life onto that buoy, and this shamanic journey work was essentially me letting go of that buoy and falling into the ocean and facing that fear of I'm gonna drown, I'm gonna die, because I'm not holding on to that buoy anymore. But there's also another part of me that's I'm so sick and tired of holding on to this buoy. I know there's something else here, and I don't think I can keep it repressed anymore. I don't think I can continue treating myself in such self-hateful ways anymore. And so dying to that and reclaiming this wild man, this sacred wild man, and also this tender young child within me, and integrating both of them, it was like I became more whole a person. And that was liberating. Very, very liberating. And since I went on that journey, I've been more reassured in continuing on that journey. On this journey of being able to embrace those moments of dying to oneself, letting go of this tight grip of the ego of I only know myself in this way. I have to know myself in this way. I have to define my identity as this, or this. And really letting things unfold more freely. And so I have, I guess, affirmations or just a simple change in my entire outlook where I, I welcome, open-handedly these opportunities to step into rites of passage, step into initiation, and step into death. This symbolic death before the final physical death and the transition thereafter. And the more that I do it, the more free I become. I think the wiser I become and the more peaceful I become. And there is then less concern of self-preservation, less concern of all this anxiety around how to keep myself safe, how to never experience loss. Because the change in outlook is that, in a way, there isn't really so much this death of like, okay, this is a permanent end. But really, all those collected experiences of ego deaths in this path of initiation and rites of passage have created this sense that, okay, well, death is actually just more of an unfolding. It's like I'm continuously peeling off layers of the onion. And so that doesn't mean I'm having this permanent end after each thing, but in fact, there's more that is unfolding, and I'm getting closer to what is true and what is at the core. And I think that's something that people are seeking, and that people also need, in that it is a very deep, embedded part within our DNA. And 2020 certainly has been a great example of that, because in a way it was an uninvited experience, to say the least. Nobody was saying, yes, bring on these events to challenge me. I'd say few people anticipated something like this. But with it, and the turbulence that it has brought, it has presented this opportunity to really go deep within oneself. And really experience a existential crisis. And perhaps maybe there's some part of this where it is a manifestation of a collective yearning for a initiation of sorts, and it just happened to manifest in this very dramatic way. But it is up to each individual person to decide how they want to work with it. But to those who feel the pull, who feel the tug, and reconnecting with these very much ancient rituals of initiation and rites of passage that are deeply important in one's growth and maturation, I give you all my best. I send you that love and energy and courage to walk that path, whether that's starting with reading books, which I recommend, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, Iron John by Robert Bly is another good one. So whether it's reading books or doing esoteric practices, so like working with the shamanic practitioner who can lead you on that shamanic journey work, or perhaps you seek a medicine men and medicine women for plant ceremonies or psychedelics, or you choose to live a monastic life and do but rigorous meditation. Whatever it is, your internal guidance system will point you in that direction. And if you choose to answer that, answer that call, answer that tug within you, may you find all the peace, power, and wisdom that lies there for you. And with that, I will pause there for today's podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. If you would like to learn more, you can follow me at www.sacredwildman.com. It'll have my links there to other media if you'd like to follow as well. And if you would like to donate to support my work, you'll also find a link on my homepage of my website where you can support me in that way if you would like. That's all for today, and I hope you have a great Friday evening.